The thermos was still on the dash when I came back to consciousness around 3 in the morning. The cab cold enough that my breath fogged the windshield, and I could see it sitting there in the grey nothing of a November night on a Cascade Pass, 2,000 feet above the valley floor, with 18 miles of switchback between me and the nearest town. I had poured that second cup at the fuel stop in Harlan's lot, the way I had done for 22 years, and set it on the passenger side corner of the dash where it always went. Delia had been gone 2 years. The cup was still warm when I poured it. It was long cold now, sitting there in the dark with the wind coming down off the ridge, and the trees on both sides of the road standing so still they looked painted. Coop was watching the tree line. He had been watching it for a while. To understand what that meant, I need to go back to the week before. Or maybe further than that. Maybe I need to go back 22 years, to a fuel stop in eastern Oregon where a woman in a green work coat handed me a thermos through the passenger window and told me she was coming along. But the week before is probably close enough. I want to say right up front that I am not a man who believes things he cannot explain. I drove long haul for 31 years. Before that, I worked diesel mechanics in a shop in Ellensburg, Washington, and I understand exactly how engines fail and why. I am comfortable with cause and effect. I have never had patience for stories that require you to set your judgment aside. If you had told me, sitting in that cab on that grade at 3 in the morning, that something was going to happen before sunrise, that I would still be turning over in my mind 7 months later, I would have told you to get some sleep and check your oil pressure in the morning. I am telling you this so you understand the weight of what follows. My rig was a 2008 Peterbilt Flatnose, 11 years old by the time of this story, with 214,000 miles on the engine and a tendency to run rough in temperatures below 25 degrees. I was hauling a flatbed load of green-cut lumber out of a mill near Clay Alum, 41,000 pounds of it sheeted down tight, northbound through a pass I had run maybe 300 times over the years. The pass road was a maintained state route, 2 lanes, cleared regularly, but it had stretches on the upper grade where the shoulder narrowed to maybe 8 feet of gravel before the bank dropped away into the trees. I knew every turn of it. I had driven it in fog, in rain, in snow that came sideways and made the white lines invisible. November was never comfortable up there, but it was manageable if you drove slow and kept your eye on your gauges. I was watching the oil temp when the power steering gave. Not all at once. First there was a heaviness in the wheel, the kind you feel before you fully register what's happening, a resistance that shouldn't be there. Then the belt let go, and I heard it go, a sharp crack like a rifle shot somewhere below me, and the wheel went to concrete in my hands. I was on the lower switchback, maybe 2 miles below the summit, doing 20 miles an hour, and I got the rig onto the shoulder on sheer arm strength and a lot of old stubbornness. I had enough momentum to ease it forward another 40 feet to a place where the shoulder widened to about 12 feet, and I set the brakes and sat there with both hands still on the wheel for probably a full minute. Coop looked at me from the passenger seat. He was a border collie mix I had picked up from a family outside Yakima 4 years earlier, mostly black with one white ear, and he had logged close to 60,000 miles in that cab with me. He was not a nervous dog. He had been through blowouts and near misses and one very bad winter night outside Spokane, when we had gone sideways into a snowbank, and he had slid right off the seat into the dash without making a sound. He was steady. He looked at me now the way he always looked at me when something went wrong. Patient, ears slightly forward, waiting to see what came next. "Belt's gone," I told him, which he already knew in the way dogs know things. I climbed down with my flashlight and confirmed it. The serpentine belt had let go clean, and without it, the power steering pump was dead and the alternator was pulling nothing. The engine would run off the batteries for a while, enough to keep the heat going, but I was not moving that rig until daylight and a roadside crew. I had 18 miles of mountain road between me and Harlan's fuel stop. The temperature on my cab gauge read 22 degrees Fahrenheit, and I had 41,000 pounds of green lumber sitting on a state road in the dark. I called dispatch and told them what had happened. The dispatcher, a young woman named Cass, whom I had never met in person, told me roadside assistance was probably 6 hours out given the hour and the location. I said that was fine. She asked if I needed anything else. I said no. She told me to stay warm and stay in the cab. I said yes, ma'am, which I probably hadn't said to anyone in months. I put the phone on the console and looked at the thermos on the dash. The second cup was stone cold by then, steam long since gone, just sitting there the way it always sat. I had been pouring that second cup since before Roy was born. Delia had started the ritual in the first month we ran together, back when she rode shotgun more for company than anything else, and then she got her CDL and we ran as a team for the better part of 6 years before Roy came and she stepped back to dispatch work. After Roy was grown and gone, she rode with me again on the longer runs, the ones through the mountains especially, because she said the mountains were too good to miss from a windshield. She always made 2 cups at the fuel stop, hers and mine, and she always set hers on the passenger side corner of the dash, where she could reach it without taking her eyes off the road. When she died, 2 Novembers before this one, I kept pouring the second cup. I set it where it always went. I did not examine this habit very closely. It was either that or stop, and I was not ready to stop. Roy hadn't spoken to me in 2 years, the same 2 years his mother had been gone. I didn't blame him entirely. We had said things to each other in the weeks after the funeral that neither of us had taken back, and the silence had hardened the way cold mud hardens into something you can't easily work. He was living in Portland, working in some kind of logistics software, which I mention only because it had always struck me as a strange place for the son of a trucker to land. I had tried calling him twice in the first 6 months and gotten voicemail both times. After that, I had stopped trying, which I told myself was respect for his distance, and which was probably something closer to the same stubbornness that had kept me hauling loads 6 days a week when I should have been sitting still with my grief. I do not know how to explain the quiet that settled around 3:15 in the morning. I can tell you what it was not. It was not the ordinary quiet of a mountain road at that hour, which has texture to it, the sound of wind moving through fir and hemlock, the occasional tick of cooling metal, the small animal sounds that you stop hearing consciously, but that are always there if you pay attention. This was a different kind of quiet. It had a quality of attention to it, if that makes any sense. And I know it probably doesn't. It was as if the whole drainage had stopped to listen for something. No wind, no branch movement, no sound from the trees at all. Coop's ears came up slow and easy, not the sharp alert he gave to a deer crossing or a strange vehicle. This was something softer. His chin came off the seat, and he looked towards the passenger window, toward the tree line on the uphill side of the road, and his tail moved twice, slow and low, which was not what he did when he didn't know what he was looking at. I reached across and checked the door lock. Old instinct. The lock was already set. My first thought was that it was a bear moving down from the upper elevation before the freeze set in hard. Black bears will work a drainage in November, fattening late, and they'll do it at night. I had seen bear sign on this pass before, though not this late in the season. That was a reasonable explanation, and I was satisfied with it for about 45 seconds until I thought about the sound, or the absence of it. A bear in the brush makes noise. Not loud noise, not crashing noise necessarily, but a bear is a heavy animal, and the hemlock duff under those trees was dry, and it would crunch. I was not hearing any crunching. I was hearing the deepest quiet I had ever heard on a mountain road. My second thought was that I was tired and that the cold had made my ears do something strange. I had been on the road since 4:30 that morning, and it was now past 3, which was nearly 21 hours, and I was sitting in a cold cab with low blood sugar and a deadbelt under my hood. That was a reasonable explanation for any number of things a man might think he was experiencing. I told myself that and almost believed it. I poured coffee from the thermos into my own cup, which was still warm because I kept it wedged between the seat and the console. I drank about half of it. Coop had not looked away from the tree line. The third explanation I tried was a road crew. The state runs maintenance trucks on these passes at odd hours, especially after the first serious freeze, checking for ice and debris. A truck might have pulled off somewhere uphill and shut down for a break. That could explain an absence of traffic sound. It did not explain why every animal in the drainage seemed to have gone quiet at the same moment. And I knew it didn't explain that, which is why the explanation sat poorly. If you have never been at high elevation in a northwest mountain pass at 3 in the morning in November, with a broken-down rig and no other traffic and no wind, I am not sure I can give you the full texture of it. The dark up there is very complete. The fir trees grow right to the edge of the road cut, and they are old trees, some of them 4 feet through at the base, and they stand close enough together that the spaces between them are black, even when your eyes have adjusted. The cold has a weight to it that the valley cold doesn't have. And the quiet I was describing was sitting inside all of that, like something placed there deliberately. I left the window cracked about an inch, the way I always did when Coop needed air, and that inch of window was enough to know that the quiet was real and external, and not some trick of an insulated cab. I reached for the door handle twice in the next hour and stopped myself both times. The first time, I told myself I was going to check the load straps, which was a reasonable thing to do and also a thing I could have done from outside the truck if I'd had any real sense that the load was at risk. It was not at risk. The straps were fine. I had checked them myself before leaving the mill. I was reaching for the door because something in me wanted to get closer to whatever was on the other side of that window, which was an impulse I did not fully trust and did not act on. The second time was around 4 in the morning after Coop had stopped looking at the tree line and had put his head back on the seat and sighed in the way he sighed before he slept. I thought, if the dog is calm, I am probably being foolish. I put my hand on the door handle and felt the cold of it through my glove, and then I sat still for a moment and thought about what I was actually going to do if I climbed down from that cab at 4 in the morning in 22-degree weather on a mountain grade with no power steering and no idea what was in those trees. I thought about Delia, who would have said, "Earl, you stubborn man, stay in the truck." I stayed in the truck. You may find it strange that I am telling you this. I have told it twice in full, once to Roy and once to a man I have known for 30 years, named Dale, who runs an auto parts warehouse in Clay Elam, and who did not call me crazy, which is why I am still talking to him. If it sounds like exaggeration, I understand that. It sounded like exaggeration to me while it was happening, and I was the one it was happening to. What I found in the morning, I found at first grey light, around 6:15. The sky had gone from black to the flat, dark grey that precedes colour, and I could make out the shapes of the trees and the road surface and the load on my flatbed, and I climbed down from the cab with my flashlight and walked the length of the rig the way I always did at first light after a breakdown, just checking, just accounting for what was there. The load was exactly as I had strapped it. 41,000 pounds of green-cut lumber still under the top, every strap seat. But at the forward end of the flatbed, at the corner nearest the passenger side, Someone or something had set down a piece of timber, not a piece from my load. This was a single Douglas fir log, roughly 8 feet long and maybe 14 inches through, bark still on, a clean break at both ends rather than a saw cut. It had been set perpendicular to the load, bridging the space between my flatbed rail and the steep bank of the cut. I stared at it for a long time. I could not have lifted that log alone without equipment. It went probably 400 pounds. I want to be careful here about what I am telling you I saw and what I am telling you I did not see. I did not see tracks in the frost, because the shoulder gravel was too coarse to hold a clear print, and anyway, by the time I found the log, the temperature had come up a few degrees, and the frost was patchy. I did not see any disturbance in the brush on the uphill side of the road that I could point to as definitive. What I saw was a log that had not been there when I pulled onto that shoulder, positioned in a way that would have been useful to me if I'd had a second man and needed to lever the rig or brace the load during a shift. It was an act of practical reasoning. Whoever put it there understood exactly what kind of trouble I was in and had done something about it in the particular language of physical work. I walked to the cab door and opened it, and Coop came down and walked to where the log was and sniffed it once, and then sat down beside it, calm as weather, like the presence of it made perfect sense to him. I stood there in the grey cold of a Cascade morning, with 41,000 pounds of lumber and a dead rig and a border collie sitting next to a log that should not have been there. And I thought about Delia. I thought about what it cost to carry a thing alone. I thought about Roy, who had his mother's stubbornness and his father's bad habit of letting silence do the damage that words couldn't, and who had been out there for 2 years in his own particular cold. I thought about 22 years of a second cup on the dash, and how it had never once felt foolish until the day I was pouring it alone, and how I had kept doing it anyway because stopping felt like losing her twice. The trees on the uphill side were still. No wind, no branch movement. But I stood there looking into the dark spaces between those old firs, and I had the clear and unreasonable feeling that I was being seen. Not watched, not studied, but seen, the way you are seen by someone who knows you well enough to understand the difference between what you're carrying and what you're saying. I raised my hand. I don't know why. It is not the kind of thing I do. But I raised my hand toward those trees and held it there for a moment, and then I let it down. I climbed back into the cab. Coop came up beside me. I looked at the dash. The second cup was still there, cold and still on the passenger side corner, the way it always sat. I reached over and I picked it up. I held it in both hands for a moment. Then I poured it out through the window slow into the gravel of the shoulder, the way you pour a drink at the end of something. Not wasted, given. Then I picked up my phone. The signal was thin, 1 bar cutting in and out. I had Cass's number from dispatch and Roy's number from 2 years of not calling it. I scrolled to Roy's name and sat there long enough that the screen went dark and I had to wake it up again. He answered on the 4th ring. His voice was thick with sleep, and I heard him register the number before he said anything, that half second of recognition and something harder to name. Dad. Not a question, not a greeting exactly, just the word, placed there. Roy. I had about 6 things I had planned to say, and I said none of them. I'm broke down on the pass. Wanted you to know I'm okay. Silence. Not unfriendly silence. Thinking silence. Which pass? North of Clay Elm. I'm fine. Belt gave out. You call roadside? Not yet. Called you first. Another silence. Longer. I heard him breathe. Okay, he said then. You need anything? No. I looked at the empty space on the dash where the cup had been. Just wanted to hear your voice. He didn't say anything for a moment. When he did, his voice was a little different, a little less careful. "I'll call you tomorrow," he said, "when you're off the mountain." "That'd be good. Drive safe, Dad." "Always do." I closed the call and sat in the cab with the phone on my knee for a while. Then I called Cass at dispatch and gave her the full rundown so she could confirm the roadside order. She told me the crew was 90 minutes out. I said thank you. I opened the thermos and poured myself a full cup, just one this time, and drank it while the sky went from grey to the flat winter white of a Cascade morning. The roadside crew was a pair of men named Paul and someone whose name I never caught, both of them competent and quick, and they had me belted and moving in under 2 hours. They did not ask about the log. I did not bring it up. I had considered whether to mention it and decided that the log was not mine to explain. I left it where it was. I stopped at Harlan's fuel stop on the way down, the way I always did. Harlan Beggs had been running that place for as long as I had been running that pass, a wide, deliberate man with a grey beard, and the kind of bearing that comes from decades of watching things go wrong and right without getting swept away by either. He topped off my tanks and looked at me across the hood when I was checking the new belt. "You look different," he said. I looked up at him. "How so?" He considered that the way Harlan considered most things, taking his time. "Like you slept," he said, "which I know you didn't, so I don't know what that means." "Eventful night?" I said. He nodded slowly. He did not press. That is the thing about Harlan and about most men of that generation and that kind of work. They understand that some things are accounted for in the telling and some things are accounted for in the carrying, and they do not confuse the two. I drove home to Ellensburg that afternoon. I called Roy the next day, like he said. We talked for 40 minutes, which was longer than we had talked in 2 years combined. We did not resolve everything. We did not try to. He said he might come up in the spring, and I said the door was open. There was a quality to the conversation that I had not felt since before his mother died, a quality of two people willing to be in the same place without needing everything to be settled first. It was not reconciliation exactly. It was the beginning of one, which is the only kind of beginning that holds. I have thought about what happened on that pass more times than I can count in the 7 months since. I have not arrived at a satisfying explanation. I know what the log weighed and I know what it would have taken to carry it to where it sat, and I know that no man I'm aware of was on that mountain in the dark at that temperature, doing a trucker a courtesy. I know that Coop, who is a sensible animal with no patience for strangeness, sat beside that log as if it made perfect sense. I know that the quiet on the road that night was unlike any quiet I have heard in 31 years of driving mountain passes. I have no category for those things that satisfies me. What I have instead is what changed after. And what changed is small, which is the only kind of change that tends to last. I still run that pass. I run it probably twice a month. I still keep Coop on the passenger seat, one white ear catching the dashlight on the night runs. I still stop at Harlan's at the base, and Harlan still does not ask me much, which is a courtesy I appreciate. I still pour the second cup. I pour it at Harlan's the way I always did, at the fuel stop before the grade, and I set it on the passenger side corner of the dash where it always goes. But I do not pour it out at the end of the run the way I started doing after that night. I let it ride. I let it sit there and go cold, and then I bring it home, and I wash the cup, and I put it in the cabinet with the other cups, and the next morning I put it back in the bag with the thermos, and we go again. I do not know if this is a different kind of keeping or just the same one. I suspect it is the same one, understood a little better. Delia would probably have a word for the distinction, and I do not, which is the kind of gap that does not close. You learn to drive on roads with gaps in them. After long enough, You stop thinking about the gap and start thinking about the road. Roy came up in April, like he said he would. We worked on a fence line at the back of the property for 2 days, replacing posts, not talking any more than the work required. It was good work. On the second evening, we sat on the steps with coffee and watched Coop chase something through the far field, some imagined or real quarry moving in the last of the light, and Roy said, "He still runs like he's young." "He's slower than he looks," I said. "Most things are," Roy said. I did not tell him the full story of the pass. Not that night. Maybe I will someday when the words are better arranged. What I told him was that something happened up there that made me want to call him, and that I was glad I did. He nodded the way he nods when he understands something he is not going to say out loud, which is very much his mother's nod. I still have not told most people. I have told Dale, who listened without interrupting and said at the end, "Well, you're still here," which is the kind of thing Dale says. And I have told you, which puts you in a small group, and which I hope sits with you the way it still sits with me. Here is what I know. There was something on that mountain that night that understood loneliness in the way only a long patience can understand it. That understood what it cost me to keep a ritual for 2 years after there was no one left to share it with. That looked at a man broken down in the cold on a grade with £41,000 behind him and no one to call, and did something deliberate and practical and precise. Not something miraculous, something workmanlike, the only language I have ever spoken fluently. I am not asking you to believe that. I am asking you to consider what it would mean if it was true. Coop is on the seat beside me as I write this, the white ear lit by the window. He is an old dog by any useful measure, and he sleeps more than he used to. When we run the pass at night, which we do twice a month, he lifts his head as we come up through the last switchbacks and looks toward the uphill tree line. Not anxious, not alert, just attentive, the way you look at a place where something good happened once and may again. I look there too. The trees are always still. The dark between them is very complete. But the thermos is full, and there are 2 cups on the dash, and the road goes on.